We tend to take things for granted. One of those things are cars. Car was invented in 1886. Before that, we had the steam engine, which was 1600s was when that came around to be. Before that, we had animals, our own leg power. But then the car came along, and since 1886, we've seen them be able to go faster. We've seen them be able to go farther. We've seen them be able to carry more things, more people, more items. And we take it for granted. My wife and I, we go to a town that's about 100 miles away to do our grocery shopping about once or twice a month. And it takes us about an hour and a half to get there. 100 miles, hour and a half. If we were to take a horse, that trip would take longer because, of course, a horse cannot go as fast as a car, and it can't sustain that high speed for as long as a car can. So the trip would be longer. But then once we get there, since we're only going there 1 or 2 times a month, we are bringing a lot of stuff back with us. I can't imagine carrying all that stuff on the way back as well, and make the trip a lot harder for us. And we probably would be even going once or twice a month. We probably, we definitely be sticking around home more often. But that's where we go to do our grocery shopping. And again, I cannot imagine making that trip by foot, using our own leg power. It'd take much longer, be much more of a hassle. So we shouldn't take technology or advancements like that, like the car, for granted, because it's very nice to have. But when we read about in the Bible here of someone traveling from one city to another, or one place to another, we can assume that they were walking. And today what we're talking about is Israel leaving Egypt after 430 years in slavery in Egypt. And God sends Moses and Aaron to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And he doesn't want to, so he sends the plagues there. And finally, Pharaoh says, "Get out of here, Israel." They take off. And it says in Exodus chapter 13, verse 17, it says, "When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness towards the Red Sea." And so it's interesting here. The Bible tells us that there were about 500,000 fighting men of fighting age that were leaving Egypt. So that doesn't include the women and children. So we can make a safe assumption that there was probably around 1 million people leaving Egypt. So they were going from northern Egypt to southern Canaan, the promised land. And you're going to have trouble finding horses and mules and donkeys and camels for that many people. So we can assume that they were walking that route. Now, there were 2 routes that they could take. There was a route by the sea, in Latin that's Via Maris. That route was the easier route. It had the nicer roads. It were trade routes, so they could have supplies along the way for the trip. And it would have taken them 4 or 5 days to get from Egypt to the southern part of Canaan. But there were also the Philistines. The Philistines were there, and they were a warring nation. The Philistine nation was set up. They had these cities. I believe there were 5 cities, and each city has a king. And every time they needed to go off to war, each king from each city would bring their troops together, and they would go off as an army to go fight. And they enjoyed fighting. They were a warring people. And so God saw that, and he said that Israel, if they were to encounter those Philistines, they would not be ready for that problem, and they would turn back to Egypt. So instead of going that easier route, that shorter route, to face the Philistines there, probably having to face the Philistines, God takes them on a longer route. And we know now today, as we read Scripture, that because of their disobedience to God, Israel ended up taking 40 years, so 4 or 5 days, the easier route, but 40 years in the wilderness, wandering the wilderness before they were allowed to enter into the promised land. But here's the thing. When they had to go into the promised land, they had to go into battle. And so those 4 or 5 days to get to Canaan and facing the Philistines, God said they are not ready for that. But after 40 years of being in the wilderness and facing everything that they did in the wilderness, God allowed them to go into the promised land and go to battle, because all that happened in that 40 years prepared Israel to fight. And this is something interesting for us to think about. Because for Israel, for 430 years, they were slaves. So they were using shovels, they were using tools to make things, and they would have quickly had to trade those shovels, those tools, to trade things for swords and spears to go fight the Philistines. And God knew they weren't ready. God knew that they weren't ready. So he sends them another way, and that prepares them to fight. And it's interesting for us, when you walk in your relationship with God, sometimes you're going to encounter those times where you're like, man, this is tough. This kind of seems like an uphill battle here. Every day I'm walking up a hill when it comes to my relationship with God. And if that's the case for you, or maybe you have those seasons where you feel like that's the case for you, that might just be because God is preparing you for something that is coming your way. Where if you were just to go a different path, if you were to go to your own path and encounter that thing, you would not be able to handle it. So for the Israelites, it was fighting, it was war. They wouldn't have been able to handle it those first few days after leaving Egypt, but after 40 years in the wilderness, they were ready to handle it. So if you're going through a time where you feel like you're in an uphill battle, realize or go to the Lord and ask him, are you preparing me for something? Is there something coming my way that you are preparing me mentally, preparing me spiritually for, so that I can go against it, and through your strength I can conquer it? We see that example used here in the Bible, that God knew Israel wasn't ready. And so he prepared them in his own way through their, again, 40 years in the wilderness, their disobedience, but by the end of it, they were ready to fight. And so if you're going through something like that, maybe by the end of this, you'll be ready to fight whatever's coming your way. So thank the Lord that he is preparing you for whatever is to come. And thank the Lord that he's given you the opportunity, or he's given you the strength to overcome whatever is coming your way. And again, this isn't to say that every time you face a trial or challenge that something bigger is coming your way, but we see that sometimes that can be the case. And so you should go to the Lord and find out if it is or not. With all that said, guys, just kind of an interesting thought for you today. But thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.